Her cruel uncle beat her in public for dropping a plate. The cowboy watching had seen enough. I'll tell you the exact moment. There's a sound a hand makes when it hits the side of a person's face, and that person wasn't expecting it. Not the crack, the other sound. The one after, when the body flinches. It's quiet. But I've heard it enough times in my life that it gets into me somewhere deep and I can't get it back out. I was sitting on a barrel outside Eula Marsh's dry goods, eating a cold biscuit I'd bought for 2 cents, watching the main street of Rossender the way a man does when he's got nowhere particular to be. It was a Thursday, September. The dust that day had a grayish cast to it, the kind that means distant fire somewhere north. I remember that because I remember thinking the whole town looked like a photograph of itself, rather than the real thing. I was 39 years old, no wife, no particular future I could point to. I worked for Cass Hollowell on his spread east of town, handled horses mostly, slept in a bunkhouse with 2 other men who didn't talk much, which suited me. I wasn't looking for anything that Thursday. Clara Prentice came out of the hotel. She was carrying a tray with 4 plates balanced on it, dinner rolls and a soup bowl and a coffee cup and some such, and she was moving fast, the way a woman moves when she's afraid to be too slow. Her uncle Eldon Prentice ran the Rossender Hotel and the saloon beside it, and a considerable portion of the town's quiet misery. He was a thick man, red through the neck, hands like he'd been built for hauling freight and instead spent them on other things. He was standing in the street when she came out, and she didn't see him in time, and the edge of the tray caught his arm, and the plate with the soup bowl went. It didn't even shatter, just fell flat and broke in 2 pieces, not loud. Eldon hit her before the pieces stopped sliding. Not an open hand, a fist, half closed, against the side of her head, which knocked her sideways, and she caught herself on the hitching rail and stood there with her hand pressed to the wood and her other hand pressed to her ear, and she was not crying, which I noticed. She knew better than to cry where he could see it. The street didn't stop. 2 men walking past looked away. A woman across the way found something urgent to do with her shopping basket. That's Rossender. That was Rossender. It was the kind of town where a man's cruelty to his own blood is his own business and you don't stick your nose in. I was off the barrel before I'd decided to get off it. I crossed the street and I didn't run. There was no point running. I walked the way you walk when something's already settled in you and the only question is how far it's going to go. I came up behind Eldon and I said his name, and when he turned around I was already closer than he was comfortable with. I'm not a large man. I'm 5'11", and in those days I ran about 170 pounds, and I looked like what I was, which was someone who'd spent 15 years outside doing hard things. Eldon was bigger, it didn't matter. I told him I'd just watched what he did, and I was going to say it plain. If he put his hands on her again while I was in this town, he and I were going to have a different kind of conversation. He told me some things about myself, none of which were kind. I let him finish. Then I looked at Clara. She'd straightened up by then. She was watching me with her hands still touching the side of her face, and her eyes were a color I didn't have a name for exactly, not gray, not green, something in between. She was maybe 24, 25. She had a way of holding herself that made you think she'd learned to take up as little space as possible, and somewhere underneath that was a woman who could have taken up a great deal of it. I asked her if she was all right. She said yes, a reflex. Then she said, quieter, that she wasn't sure. I picked up the broken plate pieces off the dirt and set them on her tray. I don't know why I did that. Something to do with my hands, maybe. Something so she wasn't standing there with nothing to hold. Eldon told me to get on about my business, and I told him I would, but I'd said what I said, and he ought to remember it. Then I walked back across the street and finished my biscuit. That was the beginning of it. I want to say I left it there. For about 2 weeks I tried to. She worked the hotel breakfast and supper shifts, and the front desk some days, and occasionally the saloon when her uncle needed her behind the bar, which she hated. I could tell by the way she moved through that room, precise and untouchable, like she'd built a wall just inside her own skin. I came to town for supplies, or when Hollowell needed something from the post, and I'd see her, and I'd tip my hat, and she'd nod, and that was it. She didn't seem like a woman looking to be rescued, which made it harder to walk past. The second time was maybe 2.5 weeks after the plate incident. I came in on a Saturday evening to pick up a parcel for Hollowell boot leather he'd ordered from a man in Abilene, and the saloon was loud, and Clara was behind the bar. There was a man named Deke Fulmer who drank there most evenings and who thought very highly of himself in a way that most of the town had stopped questioning. He had his hand on the bar in front of her, and he was leaning in, saying something I couldn't make out over the noise, and she was standing still with her chin down, and her jaw set the way a person stands when they're waiting for a thing to be over. I pulled up a stool at the far end and ordered a whiskey, and Fulmer looked over at me once, and I looked back at him and didn't look away until he straightened up and said something loud to the man beside him and moved down the bar. Clara brought me the whiskey without me saying anything further, set it down in front of me, and for just a second she held my eye. She said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, "Thank you." I asked for what. She said she'd have figured it out herself, but it helped. I drank the whiskey. I left a quarter on the bar, which was too much, and she looked at it and then at me, and I said, "Just say it was for the broken plate." She almost smiled. Not quite, something around the edges of it. I collected Hollowell's parcel and went back out into the dark. The third time I didn't see coming. It was October by then, cold at night, but still burning hot come midday, the way the plains do before they finally give in to the season. I was coming back through Rossender on a Sunday after taking 2 horses up to the Devereux place. Came up the South Road, and I heard it before I got to the hotel. Not the same sound as the first time, worse. I tied my horse to the nearest post and went around to the back of the hotel, where the sound was coming from, the alley between the hotel and the feed store. And Eldon Prentice had Clara up against the wall of the building with his forearm across her collarbone, and he was talking at her in that low, ugly register that a man like that uses when he doesn't care who hears because he's never been made to care. She'd done something he didn't like. I found out later she'd refused to tell him where she'd been on her half-day off, which was her right. But Eldon had no use for the word right when it applied to anyone but himself. I put my hand on his shoulder and pulled him back. He came around swinging. I let the first one slide off my forearm and hit him twice in the body, short, and when he bent I got hold of his collar and walked him backward into the opposite wall of the alley and held him there until he was done struggling. I told him again. I told him slower this time. I wasn't going to keep having this conversation, and the next time he put his hands on her was going to be the last time he did it without consequence. I wasn't talking about the law. The law in Rossender was a man named Ob Cutter who owed Eldon money and wasn't going to be of use to anyone. I told him I was talking about me. He was breathing hard. Something moved across his face that I recognized. The calculation a man makes when he figures out the thing in front of him isn't going to quit, and he'd better think about whether it's worth it. I let him go and stepped back. He straightened his shirt and said I was a dead man and walked out of the alley. Clara was standing where he'd left her, rubbing her collarbone with her thumb. She had a mark across her neck from his arm. She looked at me with those in-between eyes, and she wasn't afraid exactly, but something close to it. Not of me, of the whole shape of things, of how little of it she controlled. She asked what I thought I was doing. I said I thought I was doing the obvious thing. She said Eldon would make good on what he said. I told her I didn't set a great deal of store by Eldon's word on anything. She looked at me for a long time. Then she asked my name and I gave it, Will Garner, and she said, Clara Prentice, like it was something she was confirming more than telling me. Then she said, he wasn't always like this. After her mother died and the ranch went under, her uncle was the only blood she had left in 2 states, and she'd come out here 3 years ago and it had gotten worse, not better. She said it the way you say things you don't normally say out loud, testing whether the words still mean what they did in your head. I asked why she hadn't left. She looked at her hands, said she didn't have enough to get anywhere that mattered, and the one time she'd tried he'd found out and told her she'd go back to nothing and nobody. I thought about that. I told her I worked for Hollowell and he wasn't using the line shack on the south pasture, and it wasn't much, but it was a lock on the door and it wasn't here. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said she couldn't just go off with a man she'd spoken to 3 times. I said that was fair. I said she could take a day to think on it. I'd be at Eula Marsh's dry goods at 8 in the morning the day after tomorrow if she wanted to talk further, and if she didn't, I wouldn't bother her. Then I walked back out of the alley and untied my horse. She was at Eula Marsh's at 7:58. She had a canvas bag that wasn't very full, and she was wearing a coat that was too light for the coming winter, and she looked like she'd made up her mind sometime in the night and didn't intend to unmake it. I bought her a coffee from Eula's stove, and we stood outside, and she drank it, and I watched the street, and we didn't talk much. I said, "You understand this isn't." I was working out how to say it without making it something it wasn't yet, and also without making it nothing, which it wasn't either. She said she understood. Then she said she appreciated me not saying it a stupid way. I had to think about that for a second. We rode out to the Hollowell place, and I talked to Cass, who was a decent man and who had met Eldon Prentice twice and had his own opinion of him. Cass said the shack was hers if she needed it, and he could use someone to help his wife Martha with the household work if she was looking for something honest to do. She was. She took the shack and she took the work, and she did it as well as she did everything, which was better than most men I'd known. Eldon came out to the Hollowell place 9 days later. He came with Deke Fulmer and another man I didn't know. Cass let me handle it. I walked out to meet them with my rifle across my arm, not raised, just there. And I stood at the gate and told Eldon that Clara Prentice was working for the Hollowells now, and was no longer his employee or his concern, and that if he had papers saying otherwise, he was welcome to go find a judge in Hardin County who'd look at them. He didn't have papers. He had a lot of words, and Fulmer had some words, and the third man mostly sat his horse and looked uncomfortable. When they ran out of words, I told them they were off Hollowell land and to go be off it. They went. I stood at that gate for a while after they rode out, watching the dust settle. What a man feels when a thing like that is done isn't always what you'd expect. It wasn't triumph. It was more like the satisfaction of something set right. The way a fence post feels when it's tamped in solid and doesn't wobble. That simple. I'm not going to put a bow on what happened between Clara and me, because it didn't happen in a bow kind of way. It happened in pieces, the way things do when both people involved have reasons to be careful. She worked for Martha Hollowell, and I worked the horses, and we'd see each other at supper when Cass had all his hands eat together. She didn't talk to me differently than she talked to anyone else, but she listened differently. There's a thing a person does with their attention when they've decided someone is worth it, and she did that. She'd catch something I said across a table, some small thing, and remember it weeks later like she'd written it down somewhere. Winter came in hard that year. First snow in November, serious snow by the end of it. The shack had a wood stove, and Cass kept it in wood, and Clara kept the fire going herself. She was that kind of woman, didn't wait for someone else to manage a thing she could manage. And some evenings when the cold was serious, I'd walk over to make sure the stove was drawing right because there was a damper issue I knew about, and she'd have coffee already on, and we'd sit there. Those evenings, I don't know how else to say it except that I hadn't sat with another person like that in a long time. The shack was small, and the stove was loud in the cold the way stoves are, that ticking metal sound, and outside the wind did what it wanted, and inside we were warm. She'd talk sometimes, her mother, what the ranch had been like when her father was alive. What she'd wanted to be when she was a girl, which had been impractical, and which she'd given up on without ever deciding to give up. I listened. I'm better at listening than talking, always have been, but when I talked she didn't look out the window and she didn't fill the space before I finished. I don't know when I started wanting more than the evenings. Sometime in December, maybe. It didn't announce itself. She did. One night in January, cold enough that the water in the barrel at the shack door had gone to ice by 4 in the afternoon, she said, "Will." And then she said, "I know what you think you are to me. I want you to hear what I think you are." I told her she didn't have to. She said she did. She said, when I was standing in that alley and Eldon had me against that wall, I'd already talked myself into the thing I was going to say to myself after, the way you do when you've learned there's no point fighting it. And then there was your hand on his shoulder, and it was like the whole story I'd written about how things worked turned out to be wrong. She said, "You didn't ask for thanks and you didn't make me feel like I owed you. You just stood there between me and the thing that was hurting me. 3 times. And then you gave me a door to walk through and you let me decide whether to walk through it." She said, "I'm 31 years old. I don't have a great many illusions left about men. You are not like what I thought men were." The stove ticked outside the wind. I reached over and I took her hand. She was sitting close, the shack being small, and her hand was warm because she'd been holding her coffee cup. I held it and didn't say anything because there wasn't a thing I could have said that would have been worth saying. After a while, she put her head against my shoulder, and we sat like that until the fire needed wood and I got up and fed it. I want to tell you the rest quickly because the rest is long and mostly good, and I've never been comfortable talking about good things at length. Eldon Prentice left Rossender the following spring. There were some debts that caught up with him and some trouble I don't need to go into, and he took what he had and left on a Tuesday in March, and I never saw him again. The hotel went to a woman named Frances Opp, who ran it in a sensible way, and made it something you'd actually want to stay in. Clara and I were married in June, out at the Hollowell place, with Cass and Martha as witnesses and a preacher named Aldous who had a good handshake. It wasn't a large affair. Neither of us was a large affair kind of person. Cass offered me a partnership on the South section when he got it into his head that he was getting too old to manage the whole spread. I took it. It became our place, Clara's and mine, over the better part of 3 years, the kind of belonging that happens through work and weather and shared decisions, not through any single moment of deciding. People in Rossender, once Eldon was gone and the whole of it was known, had a way of looking at me that I didn't always know what to do with. Some of it was respect. Some of it was the town's way of apologizing for looking away that Thursday. I never said anything about it either way. What I know is this. There's a morning I go back to more than the others. February of the year we married. I was out before dawn checking the line on the south fence. It had been wind that week, and the wire sometimes worked loose at the corners, and the snow was hard and crusted, and my breath was coming in puffs. I came back up the rise toward the house, and the light was just starting in the east, that pale gray that hasn't made up its mind to be morning yet, and the lamp was on in the kitchen window. She was up before me, which she usually was. I stood on that rise for a minute, just looking at that square of yellow light in all that cold gray, and I thought about every morning I'd come back to a dark window, every breakfast I'd eaten alone, every supper. Then I went inside. She was at the stove. She looked over her shoulder when she heard the door and said something about the temperature and was the fence line all right. I said it was. She turned back to the stove. I stood there with the cold still on my coat, and I looked at her and I thought, this is what I was walking toward. All those years, all that empty country, all those mornings I drove toward the horizon not knowing what was past it. I went to her and I put my hand on her back and I didn't say anything and she leaned into it, just slightly, the way she does when she's glad I'm there but doesn't need me to make a thing of it. Her hair was loose and there was flour on the side of her hand, and outside the world was frozen and pale and enormous. I was 52 years old by then. I knew enough to know what I had. I've known enough to know it every morning since.